The Cyber Policy Initiative advances the field of cyber policy by examining the intersection of national security, politics, and technology. It serves as a forum through which hackers, technologists, academics, and the cyber research community can engage with policymakers at all levels of government to strengthen U.S. cyber posture, especially as it relates to the critical infrastructure that safeguards American democracy, such as our election systems. With CPI, the Harris School leads a growing movement of elite policy schools in emphasizing the role of cybersecurity in domestic and international policy decisions. CPI runs the Voting Machine Hacking Village, or Voting Village, at DEFCON, the world's largest and longest-running hacker conference. Participants in the Voting Village work together to test various types of voting machines and other parts of election infrastructure in order to identify and fix vulnerabilities and better educate election officials and the public about the work necessary to secure our elections. The results of this research have been published in 2 award-winning reports on election security. As an intern with CPI, I have the opportunity to learn about the state of our election security and connect the work done in the previous 2 DEFCONs to current policy by contributing to memos to state officials on the vulnerabilities of voting machines used in their states. I look forward to the opportunity this summer to help prepare for DEFCON 27 and to see firsthand the way these hackers are working to protect our democracy by exposing vulnerabilities in our voting machines, election websites, and other critical election infrastructure. For today's discussion on election security, we are joined by CPI Executive Director Jake Braun and CPI Academic Advisory Board Member Anthony Fowler. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Mr. Braun was appointed by President Barack Obama as White House liaison to the Department of Homeland Security. He also served on President Obama's transition team as Deputy Director for the National Security Agency's review. Before this, he served as the National Deputy Field Director to the 2008 Obama for America campaign, overseeing an effort that utilized the most sophisticated grassroots social media and data analysis available. Anthony Fowler is an associate professor at the Harris School and sits on CPI's Academic Advisory Board. His research applies econometric methods for causal inference to questions in political science, with particular emphasis on elections and political representation. His specific interests include the causes and consequences of unequal voter turnout, explanations for incumbent success, the politics of policymaking in legislatures, and the credibility of empirical research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Fowler and Jake Braun.
Thank you all very much. Welcome to the Keller Center. Do you like it? Here we are. I'm delighted to talk to Jake Braun today about election security and cybersecurity. But before we talk too much about election security, I'd love to hear, Jake, hear more about your experiences and how you got interested in elections to begin with. You were, among many things, at one point you were John Kerry's field director in Michigan, and you had some interesting experiences there that maybe led you down this path. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks, and by the way, welcome. Thanks for coming to our shtick here. So, yeah, as field director for Kerry in Michigan, I remember driving around Detroit on election day, and so many places had 5-hour-long lines, 4-hour-long lines, 6-hour-long lines. And I was like, what is this? You know, and I'm like, how can this be okay, you know, to have lines this long? You know, obviously we had, you know, thousands and thousands of walk-offs, as they called it, people who would leave because they couldn't wait in line. And of course the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, had not told me until 4 days before the election that there would be lines at all, much less 6-hour-long lines. And so that kind of stuck with me. And then after the election, I read about in Ohio, some pretty good research was done by some folks at Ohio State that found that 20,000 votes were lost in Columbus alone because of long lines. And that didn't even count Toledo, Cincinnati, et cetera. And there were, I think, 40,000 uncounted provisional ballots in the state. And so, not to be a sour grapes Democrat, but Kerry might have actually won Ohio and thus the presidency had we not had this infrastructure problem. And so that kind of got me very attuned to this issue from early on in my career.
And Michigan is one of these states that administers elections at the town level. It's very decentralized. That's true in almost all states that it's either at the county or the town level, but very often you'll have the person who normally gives out dog licenses for a living is now running the election.
Right.
So it is kind of amazing the way that we run elections in the U.S.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially when you think about it from like a major urban area like Detroit, or one of the bigger student areas like Ann Arbor, where you've got a million or several 100,000 people voting. You need somebody like a logistics engineer type person in place, like the guy or gal who runs the Ford plant in Detroit. You need that person running elections in Detroit, and that is decidedly not who we've got running elections, unfortunately, in most of the country.
And in some ways, the problem of election lines is it's a very predictable problem, right? You know roughly how many people are going to be voting. You have a pretty good sense of when they're going to be showing up to vote. You know how many, you know what your election technology is. How many voting places do you have? How many check-in stations do you have? People can reasonably anticipate how long it's going to take, and yet they somehow were okay with these 6+ hour waits and didn't really do anything to solve it.
Yeah, it was so, and we got into this in 2008, where we started going out and asking election officials, hey, what's your plan for election day? How many machines are you going to have? How many check-in stations are you going to have, and so on? And it's pretty simple math. If you've got, especially with touchscreen voting machines, which is the main problem for long lines at least, if you got 5 machines and it takes 6 minutes to vote, which is kind of the average nationally, and the polls are open for 12 hours, well, then you can vote, I think it's like 360 people or something like that. And so if you've got 500 people who are supposed to vote in that precinct, well, then now all of a sudden you got 140 people who can't vote unless you keep the polls open for another few hours. And by the way, since a third of them show up after 5 o'clock, all of a sudden now at 5:30 you've got a 6-hour-long line. But these are all things that you don't need to be a University of Chicago professor to understand that math. That's pretty simple math. And for whatever reason, people didn't do it. And when we did go and ask, as I mentioned before, we'd hear things like, hey, don't tell me how to do my job. This is just the way it is here. Or my favorite, which was, hey, voting is everybody's civic duty. They should be proud to wait in line to cast their vote, which, as you can imagine, did not go over well with us.
And presumably this was one of the times when you really started to think about election technology. So setting aside concerns about hacking, which we will get to, obviously, there are good reasons to have low-tech paper ballots as opposed to electronic machines. As you say, if you only have 6 voting machines, there's only so many votes you can cast that day. If you have paper ballots, you can just set up a little table or buy those little cardboard stations or something like that, and you can vote as many people as you want.
Right.
So in some, this is probably a recurring theme throughout our conversation today, but the low-tech alternatives are often better for all kinds of reasons, and this is presumably a big one.
Yeah, I mean, especially in 2008 when we were going in really pushing hard to deal with this issue. I don't know if we're going to talk about later, but we were very concerned about what we were referring to as Mandela level turnout. So turnout in the African American community that would have been at the level of what it was for Nelson Mandela in South Africa when he was running as obviously the first black president of South Africa. And we were thinking we were going to have the same level of turnout in the African American community in the United States for the first black president of the United States. And we couldn't say to these election officials, go buy 1,000 more of these machines because they cost about $5,000 a pop. But we would often say, go buy 20,000 more of these little privacy booth things because they cost $10 each. And as you said, our solution that we came up with was always actually more simple than what they were already doing and less expensive than what they were already doing, and still got all the pushback that we got.
So let's talk more about the 2008 campaign. You were the field director for Obama. Arguably one of the most successful presidential election campaigns in American history, transformative for many reasons. Lots of people like to think that there was some secret sauce that you guys had. You had them, you guys had the best data team ever, and you cracked it, and it was all about technology and data science and all the things, the slogans you can see at the Harris School. What's the secret sauce behind the 2008 presidential election?
A couple things. A, Barack Obama's Superman, thing one. Thing two, everybody hated George W. Bush because of the Iraq War. And thing three, and I think this goes back to a lot of your research, By the end, we were talking to 1 million voters a day. Like literally, we had a volunteer or a staff person either in person at the doorstep or on the phone talking to 1 million people a day for the whole last 4 to 6 weeks of the election. That means we talked to something like 40, 45 million people in the last 6 weeks before Election Day in just those 13 battleground states. And again, we were able to narrow down to talking to undecideds and Democrats who didn't vote very often. So, I mean, that was kind of almost everybody that we needed to talk to. In many cases, we talked to them more than once. And, that stuff matters. Again, as your research has shown. And internally, our numbers showed this. If we had talked to somebody, and that included on the phone, they were performing double digits for us better than had we not talked to them. Meaning, if you were like a 30% likelihood to be voting for Obama by what our model said, and we had talked to you, you were performing at better than 40% likelihood of supporting Obama. I wasn't around when they did the analysis on how that worked for turnout, but my understanding was the numbers were similar. I had 6,000 field staff who worked for me, and they found volunteers in every precinct in every state, in every battleground state, to talk to all the targeted voters in those states. So the analytics was remarkable, truly. And I remember having a guy come to me one day who said, "Great news, I can target every household in the Columbus suburbs that has a 4-year-old living in it." And I was like, what am I supposed to do with that information? So there was a lot of that, and it was amazing. But I think at the end of the day, Barack Obama was amazing. People really didn't like George Bush, and we talked to a hell of a lot of people.
I think political scientists have not been rigorously studying which campaign tactics work for all that long. Maybe starting in the late 90s, early 2000s, we started doing some experiments, and now we've built up a massive, a large body of research to figure out what really does work in campaigns. And amazingly, the things that seem to be most effective are the low-tech, old-school kinds of things. Knock on someone's door and talk to them, have a conversation with them. Those are not huge effects, but you might for every door you knock on, you might get you might get a 1/100th of a vote or something like that. And so you do a lot of that, and you're gonna make a difference. And one of the studies I conducted with Ryan Enos showed that it looked like all of the Obama field operations increased turnout in battleground states by something like 7 to 10 percentage points, which is pretty big. This stuff really adds up. And interestingly, if you look historically, before 2000, there was not a difference in turnout between battleground and non-battleground states. So whatever they were doing before was not working. They were running lots of TV ads. They were doing, and Obama really changed the game. I think not in terms of, the data science was fun, obviously, but like you say, it doesn't really help you that much to know where all the 4-year-olds are. Right. What really helps is just getting more boots on the ground and knocking on doors, and that's kind of an interesting thing about elections is there's not any kind of magic here. It's just a matter of like doing hard work, and and I think you guys showed that. One
of my favorite stories from 2008, and not to litigate 2016 again, but I guarantee this did not happen for the Hillary campaign in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, or Ohio, is this guy who's a field organizer who worked for me, and we had him in some rural county in Ohio, I forget which one. And so, his first week on the job, he figures out where there's a shooting contest. I don't know what they were shooting, if it was skeet or turkeys or whatever they were shooting. And so he goes to this shooting contest. As you can imagine, you don't need a lot of targeting to realize that's not our demographic, right? And he shows up to it, and he gets his own gun out of his car and goes and shoots in the contest. He doesn't win, but he placed or something. And then he took out all these flyers and said, "Hey, I work for Barack Obama." Gave everybody a flyer and said, "I'd love to talk to you about why he should be the next president." And when you do that in every corner of every state, you're going to win over some people.
So after the election, you took a job in Homeland Security, and there you started. You had seen some of these technological problems play out in campaigns, and now you were thinking about other kinds of technological challenges that we face in other areas. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So when I got to Homeland Security, I couldn't spell cybersecurity, but we started out working on obvious things. Things like immigration, for example. I don't know if you guys remember back then, Fox News had a banner they ran on TV every day that was the war in Mexico. It was one word away from the war with Mexico, right? And so we were all dealing with Juarez and everything else. But increasingly, cybersecurity would bubble up to be one of the key issues. And I know, and it might be, shocking or surprising to know this now, but so they do a quadrennial Homeland Security review. As you can tell by the name, it's every 4 years. And the department's supposed to report to Congress what their priorities are. So when we did this in 2009, cyber wasn't even a section of the report. It got dumped in later as like, oh, this should be one of our priorities. But nobody even thought about it. By the time I left Homeland Security, all I did all day, every day was cybersecurity. And as I'm sure you're aware, it had overtaken terrorism as the #1 threat to the country. And what we realized was that, A, we were a sieve. So the Chinese, the Russians, whoever, just owned our networks. They were everywhere. We usually couldn't even find them. But we were so far behind, and I don't mean necessarily behind the Russians or the Chinese, I mean just behind where we needed to be, that we couldn't even count the number of people in cybersecurity jobs in the department because we couldn't define what a cybersecurity job was. And that was only like 6 years ago. So there's been a lot of progress since then, but it really is amazing to think that, 10 years ago, when people thought about security, very few people thought about cyber at all, and certainly nobody thought about cybersecurity when it came to elections. And now it's kind of the central thing that you can't talk about security without cyber being a part of the conversation at some level.
Mm-hmm. So then how did you become interested in cybersecurity related to elections? And obviously now this is a highly relevant issue with fears that people, outsiders, might be trying to hack our elections in some way or another. How did you come to realize that this was a big vulnerability that we needed to do some work on?
So 2 reasons. One was from my friends, the election officials, and their response after 2016. And the second thing was you, actually. And so I'll get to that in a second. In 2008, I mentioned this a minute ago, we tried, so I had all of our analytics people and everybody else build me a model that could predict how long the lines were going to be. It was amazing. We had people from Google and everywhere else working on this. It was pretty amazing. And then because I had 6,000 field staff, we canvassed basically all of the Democratic base areas, the election clerks and so on, to ask them, what's your plan to deal with Mandela level turnout? How many machines are you going to have, check-in stations, et cetera? Which we think was the largest, fastest canvas of election infrastructure, maybe in the history of the country, but regardless. And as I mentioned, we were very concerned about what they were saying about long lines and so on, or about not being ready for long lines and all this problems. But the other thing we found was these staffers would go in and talk to them and see boxes of voter registration forms kind of piled up in the corner or spilling out onto the floor or whatever, and two temporary workers in the back kind of entering them by hand. And our staffers, who could kind of do the math pretty quick, would be like, wait a second, there's 60 days till the election, and you've got about 4,000 voter registration forms filled out there. Like, those 2 people aren't going to be able to get all this entered. And they'd say, oh, don't worry, it'll get done. And our staff was like, no, it's not going to get, there's no way this gets done. And it turns out later, actually, there's been all these studies that have shown that it is actually pretty normal for the voter registration forms to not get entered before the election, or to have all of them not get, or all of them don't get entered. And so we started to get this picture that many of these election offices are kind of a mess. And I don't necessarily always blame the election official for it. They've got no budget, no expertise internally to do this stuff and so on. But nonetheless, they are not high-tech places that have the cyber forensics tools in place to detect or respond to sophisticated nation-state cyber attacks. I mean, we were talking to him about how do you just get your data entry done before the election, right? So after the 2016 election, when multiple election officials were testifying to Congress and talking to the media saying, we have no evidence that any votes were tampered with or changed or deleted or whatever, it just kind of set me off because I was like, wait a second, like I'm sure you don't have any evidence, but let's be clear that you don't have the capability to find this evidence or not find evidence or find that nothing happened. And that really bothered me. And so that was kind of thing one. I was very frustrated about that, and it didn't seem like people were calling them out. You know, Congress, DC doesn't really understand how to administer elections, and so senators and congressmen weren't kind of pushing them on this issue.
And DC doesn't really administer elections.
Right.
They don't do anything.
Right. They write checks, and only every once in a while do they even do that. So there's that. But then at the same time, as we know, all this stuff about fake news and everything was swirling. And that was disconcerting as well. However, Anthony and I had spoken multiple times and talked about his research and what I had, you know, kind of what I've been doing in my past life. And I was like, God, you know, first of all, when it comes down to targeting, I'd be shocked that these Russians are any better at targeting these voters than the Democrats and Republicans are, considering how much money we spend on this. And we have professionals who've been doing it their whole life. Secondly, we have no evidence that any of these social media ads actually change voters' behavior at all. And if you look at the vote totals in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, it doesn't seem like they did actually. Trump got fewer votes than McCain, Romney, or Bush in those states, and still won despite getting fewer votes. And then there was this argument that they were able to decrease turnout with the ads, and I'm like, well, okay, so you're going to tell me that we can't increase turnout with these ads, we can decrease turnout with these ads? I don't know if I buy it. So I decided because of that to really focus on this election infrastructure issue. And so I called up a friend of mine who runs the largest hacker conference in the world and said, hey, you know what would be cool to do this year? Why don't we hack into voting machines? And he was like, oh, that's a good idea. And he hangs up the phone, and he went on eBay and bought like 100 voting machines, all of which are used in the United States today, or the types of machines are used in the United States today. And this is despite, of course, people saying, oh, well, Russians would not have the physical access to the machines to be able to try and do these attacks, when it's like, well, actually, Russians could go on eBay and buy pallets of the machines and practice on them in Moscow for 4 years and then come back and you know, zap them pretty quickly. But anyway, so that's how it got started.
All right. Well, I didn't know I played a role in that.
You did?
That's
yeah.
funny. Yeah. And I don't know, obviously, whether the fake news was effective or not, but I certainly agree with the sentiment that even the professional campaign consultants are not very good at micro-targeting, so it's hard to imagine that the Russian hackers are really good at micro-targeting. I'm actually having my undergraduates right now try to predict who voted for who in the 2016 presidential election using the same kind of information you would have as a campaign consultant, and I think they're getting frustrated with how bad their predictions are, and they're coming to me saying, all I can get is an R squared of 0.3 or something like that. That's not very good. What's good enough? And I'm like, I don't know, but maybe that's as good as you can do. It's a hard problem for sure. Right. And the costs of mistargeting are also pretty high, which is partly why it's hard to find much evidence that digital advertising of any kind is really all that effective in elections. And that's why we say that knocking on doors is maybe the best thing you can do. Yeah, okay. That's fascinating. So this interest in the voting technology led you to create the vote hacking village at DEFCON. Tell us a little about DEFCON, which is an unusual thing in and of itself, and then tell us about the voting village at DEFCON.
Sure. So DEFCON's the largest hacker conference in the world. It's about 30,000 hackers in Vegas, which is kind of ironic because Vegas is a city built for people who don't understand math. And the hackers are obviously very good at math for the most part. And but it started because it was some guy's birthday 20 years ago, and it just grew from there. And they hack all manner of things, anything you can think of. They hack cars, they hack adult toys, they hack voting machines. This year we'll be doing AI, trying to uncover deep fakes. But it also has kind of an ethos of punk rock conference as well as high tech conference. So even the Homeland Security guys and gals who go, when they go, they will dye their hair green for the conference so that they fit in. There's lots. It's a little like being a Lollapalooza. There's lots of tattoos and piercings and so on, but there's also some of the best hackers on the planet who work for the most secret intelligence agencies all around the world. And while they go to kind of see and be seen and go to parties and hear talks, they also are kind of locked in these death match competitions where they're competing against each other in different hacker games, trying to hack one team or defend against another team, largely for bragging rights. There's not like cash prizes or anything. It's just they all kind of want to show off, like anything else. It's like academia, kind of. It's at the end of the day, it is kind of a small community,
Sure. It is a sight to behold, DEFCON. I was fortunate enough to go last year, and Vegas is already a strange place to be, and then you add in that hacker community, and it's pretty fascinating. So the voting village is a village within DEFCON where people are focused just on hacking into election machines. And so that's exactly what they do. The hackers come in, you give them the machines, and you say play around and see if maybe you can change the vote totals from the electronic voting machines. Can you change the names of the candidates? Can you create mayhem? Can you delete things? And they do. We talk about that. And you make some people unhappy when you do this.
Yes. So part of that comes from one of the things that was being said repeatedly after the 2016 election is, the machines are air-gapped. So air-gapped is a nonsensical word when it comes to cybersecurity. That means that the machine, essentially what it means is the machine doesn't touch the internet. Some people would say it doesn't touch another network, but for all intents and purposes, in this case, it means it doesn't touch the internet. However, that's ridiculous because it will invariably touch something that touches the internet, like, for example, the jump drive they use to program the machine for every election. And if I can pause on the air gap thing for a moment, because we tried to make this point to election officials and vendors after 2016, which was, look, no one faults you guys for the fact that a nation state was able to jump the air gap and hack the machines. Like, protecting our democracy from nation states was not in your job jar up until 6 months ago. So we don't fault you for not getting this right. But they would still insist on saying, oh, no, this is air gapped, air gapped. What we would then try and explain nicely was, look, the Iranians thought that their centrifuges were air gapped as well because they buried them in concrete vaults underground in the desert in Iran. And the NSA jumped the air gap every single time it needed to, with every update it needed to get in to hack those centrifuges. But that didn't matter. They were like, well, that's different. Oh, in fact, no, it's not. Cyber is cyber. And so, of course, the first machine, so we on the first DEFCON, or the first voting village, we started out with some speakers. I was running a speaker track. Within 2 minutes of them giving the hackers access to the machines, and there's all this consternation before, like, what if the hackers can't get in before the weekend's over? We're going to do years of damage to these security concerns. Within 2 minutes of having access, the first hacker got into the first machine and he did it remotely. He didn't even touch the machine. And he was able to totally take it over, cast votes, delete votes, do whatever he wanted, change candidates. And it turned out that the machines were so insecure, they were such Swiss cheese, that the hackers actually got bored with them by the end of the weekend and started doing things like playing cat videos on them, or like, I don't know if people remember what Rickrolling is. They were like Rickrolling each other with the machines, like, oh, hey, push that button, and they push it, and that Never Gonna Give You Up song would start playing. It was literally that bad. They would find like the administrative password for a whole class of machines just by Googling administrative password for this machine. It was truly remarkable. And I will say, so 2 things about the first DEFCON, not to talk ourselves up. I'll give all the credit to my co-founders, not me. The machine that the guy got into remotely in 2 minutes was decommissioned from the state of Virginia. a year earlier than it was going to be decommissioned because of that. And secondly, despite the fact that this whole, hey, everything's okay because we have no evidence anything was breached, had gotten Congress to kind of stop talking about this for a little while. They were in quite a lull. Hundreds of media stories and so on that came out of this, and the fact that we had multiple members of Congress there, was one of many things. One of the things that got them to appropriate about $383 million for election security to be spent before 2020. So we think it had some actual impact on policy too.
We have a video, actually. We have a couple videos. I think just to make the point, perhaps, that hacking into a voting machine is not as difficult and dramatic as you might have thought. Can we roll the first video?
I'm very concerned for our upcoming election because this voting machine is used in 18 different states, and it's extremely easy to get admin access on this machine. So let me show you how quick it is. It's about a little under 2 minutes. All they have to do, this bad actor, would be to open up this machine by pressing this button right here. When it's off, removing the card reader, removing this, you don't need any tools to do this. Unplugging this, again, you don't need any tools to do this. Turning it on, all you have to do is pick this lock here with a ballpoint pen, open this up, press the red button, and we're gonna let it boot up here, and then I'll show you the admin access. So it's loading what they call a secure voting terminal right now. And here we're going to see a couple of error messages, and all you have to do to bypass those error messages is just click cancel and OK. And now I have full admin access under 2 minutes.
So that woman is not actually a hacker. Well, I guess she is now, but when she walked into the conference, she wasn't a hacker. She was a layperson that one of the hackers taught how to do that in a few minutes, and with a few practice tries, she was able to get it done. I think the most disconcerting thing about it isn't that she's not a trained hacker, because almost nobody had any previous knowledge of the machines when they walked into DEFCON. Was that she did it in 2 minutes, and it takes the average person, if we remember from early in the conversation and trying to figure out how we're going to predict long lines, it takes the average person about 6 minutes to vote. So in the amount of time that a poll worker or a voter could reasonably be expected to be standing in front of a machine, you could take it over.
Sure, yeah, that's pretty troubling. And we can come back to, there's a lot of exciting things to talk about DEFCON. One of the things that you talk about a lot is that perhaps our biggest security risks are not the voting machines themselves, which are a big risk, but also the voter database and the websites of the Secretary of State's office, where they keep the voter rolls, and also where they post the results of the election. You could imagine somebody hacking, for example, the Secretary of State's website that gives the results of the election. That may not be a big legal issue, but that could create all kinds of mayhem. And so if you were an outside actor just trying to mess up democracy, it might actually be very easy. And that was one of the things that you talked to the hackers about. You said, would you like to also show how easy it is to hack into the Secretary of State's websites? And they told you, that's too easy for us, that's boring for us. Right? Yeah.
Right. So the chairman of our board at CPI is the most recent U.S. ambassador to NATO, Doug Luke. And he and I have talked a lot about, what's Putin's endgame here? What's he trying to do? And Doug says, well, he's decided he can't beat us with conventional military, by conventional military means. So he wants to kind of make our society crumble from within. And he's kind of latched onto this kind kind of promoting the fissures in our society, but also making us not trust our basic institutions like democracy. And so if you think about what's the easiest way to do that, it's not actually to go hack voting machines. Like we kind of did that to make a point that like the machines are hackable and they're not air-gapped, and don't say they are. But what's far easier is what Russia's already done, which is hack websites and hack the voter registration databases. And again, I didn't kind of just come up with this because of my dystopian view of the future. It's because Russia did exactly this in the Ukraine in 2014. They hacked a government website that announced the election results. Fortunately, the Ukrainians caught it and took the website down. But it didn't matter because Russian television announced their preferred candidate had won. And then, of course, all chaos ensued. So similarly, Russia could do what they've already done here, which is hack the voter registration databases, and instead of just stealing records and scanning the databases and so on, delete some people or change some names and addresses around. So then not only do we have long lines, but we have lines that are twice as long, and people are leaving line, talking to the press, who's obviously posted up on election day, interviewing people leaving the polling place all day, saying, hey, I've voted in this precinct for 20 years, and now they're telling me that I'm not registered here. This is totally bunk. There's a problem, blah, blah. So you have the media, capturing these stories all day, every day all day on election day. And then that night, Russia, again, this isn't something I'm just coming up with. They do exactly what they did in Ukraine already, which is hack the websites of, let's say, Ohio and Florida, and change the election results around, or just make it so it's detectable that it's been hacked, and then the secretaries of state in Ohio and Florida have to take the websites down, and then Wolf Blitzer's up there like losing his mind on TV all night. And as you can imagine, then if Russian TV announces their preferred candidate had won, well, the extreme left or the extreme right or whatever, whoever candidate that was, I think we can maybe guess, but anyway, would start running with that story, right? Then their more mainstreamish press would eventually start, so either Fox or MSNBC, whichever one, would start running with it as if it was real. And by the time we unwound that whole thing to figure out who was deleted and who wasn't and what was the election result and was the whole thing hacked, it would have make Bush v. Gore look like well-ordered democracy. However, as Anthony said, my problem in trying to kind of show all this was that DEFCON is at its very core a hacker conference. And if you're not doing things interesting to the hackers, you don't get invited back. And so they were like, yeah, we don't care about hacking websites. We did that 20 years ago. Fortunately, though, there's a division of DEFCON.
Well, maybe we should just show the video.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Jake came up with a creative solution to show that this was in fact a vulnerability in a way that that maybe makes the point even better. Can we show the next video?
My name is Cordy, and I am 7.5.
My name is Bianca Lewis. I'm Audrey Jones. I'm 11 years old.
My name is Dorrington Linsky, and I'm 11 years old. My name is Alex, and I'm 7 years old, and I'm hacking into voting.
It took you 10 minutes to hack the website.
Well, I was kind of distracted at the time.
Is this pretty easy for you?
Yeah.
Is it hard or easy to hack the election?
It's actually really easy. I bet the Russians could do it in their sleep.
Why do you say that?
Because, well, it's not that secure. I think America as a whole thing should just work on its computer security.
To be a really good programmer, you have to know how to do it the opposite way. trying to do this for me to learn how to hack different things and then find the bugs and then try to fix it.
You haven't decided whether to use your powers for good or evil.
Lean towards good.
What is your message to the American people?
Work on your computer security, people.
So I was sitting with a reporter explaining my conundrum, and he's like, yeah, it's child's play for the real hackers. And I was like, right, it's child's play. So there's a division. As I said, this conference started about 20 years ago when all these folks were teenagers in early college. Well, they've all since had kids. And so since they didn't want to not go to DEFCON anymore, they set up a whole section for kids at DEFCON. And so we gave it to this section. It's called Roots Asylum. And so we gave it to them, and they had kids hack the machine, or they hack the websites and change all the stuff around, as you saw. The thing that was the most incredibly frustrating about this was that, and I didn't get resolution on this until just a few weeks ago. The election officials, as you can imagine, they had something to say about this. And they were like, well, that's not our website. And we said, yeah, of course it's not your website, but because that would be illegal. So we rebuilt websites with the same basic configurations as yours. And that looked exactly like theirs. And we have the kids using what has been identified by a whole host of organizations around the world as the most commonly used exploit against websites, a SQL injection against websites to defeat them, or to go in and hack them and do whatever you want with them. And all these secretaries of state and others are like, that is completely unacceptable. We have all these security practices in place. There's no way that some kid could take a SQL injection and or that you could use a SQL injection and hack our websites, blah, blah, blah. And so we kind of didn't have a good response to it. I mean, I would go and talk to my friends at NSA and other hackers, and they would all say, well, that's crazy. Their websites, I don't care what they have on them, they're no more secure than everybody else's websites, and these SQL injections work on to hack these websites. And then 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, the Mueller report comes out. And in there, it says, well, Russian hackers use SQL injections to hack Secretary of State websites, and they then got from there into the voter registration databases. That, by the way, addresses a couple issues. Number one, the Russians were using the exact same attack that these kids were using and did get into the real websites. Number two, not only do the election officials often say that the machines are air-gapped, but they usually say that the voter registration database is air-gapped. And thus, you would need physical access from the clerk's network to the voter registration database to hack it. Well, it turns out no. You could get to it while sitting in the Kremlin by using a SQL injection like the kids did, hacking their website, and then getting into the voter registration database, which is far more nefarious than what the kids were doing and messing around with the vote totals.
So tell us, what do the cybersecurity people say is the best way to run an election, given these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, the most high-tech of all of them say it's paper ballots and risk-limiting audits, which is a certain type of audit. And essentially that on the night of the election, before you officially announce the results, you go in and you count a small but statistically significant number of ballots by hand. And if it matches within a certain deviation, you understand this up at night, then you say, okay, great, we can say that this person won and this person lost. And if it's closer, then you just need to count more of them until you get there. But again, the easiest, cheapest, and lowest tech option is actually the most secure option.
Who would have thought, after all the technical stuff we train people at the Harris School, paper ballots, you can go back and count them, and then you just do these audits, which basically is just you count a certain number of ballots and you test for statistical significance. It's technology that we had in the 1920s and before.
Yeah.
So last year at DEF CON, you had a group of secretaries of state who wrote basically a cease and desist letter and said, stop doing what you're doing. They have an argument. We can talk about it. Their argument is elections and democracy are all about trust. And you guys at DEFCON are ruining trust in elections. Regular voters are going to see that you're doing this, and then they're not going to have faith in the results of elections, and the whole system doesn't work if you ruin trust in elections. So what's your response to that argument?
Yes, this is my favorite argument. I refer to it as my Chinese Communist Party argument versus the Enlightenment, meaning that the way the Chinese Communist Party generally deals with problems with their government is they first say, stop talking about whatever this problem is, you're just going to make it worse. We'll go maybe try and deal with it, but you all need to stop talking about it. Fortunately for us, the secretaries of state cannot resort to the same measures the Chinese government does to get us to shut up. But they do spend a lot of time shouting us down and calling what we're doing into question and so on and so forth. But it really is no different. Just stop talking about it. Everyone will forget that there's a problem. And then they'll have trust for some reason. However, before I get to the other way that I view this, play that out, just for a couple election cycles, right? So if the way we do it is to say, hey, there's problems, there's actually a lot of problems, but you know what? We're on the case. We know that there's problems. We've got all these hackers who are trying to find the problems so people can fix them. You have national security people who are spending money and time and resources to fix them. You have the election officials who are taking this very seriously. They're going to fix these problems, blah, blah. And so, but look, we know there's problems, but we're going to fix it. And then if we get hacked again, what you have been saying is not called into question, right? You can say, yeah, we told you that there were problems. We admitted wholeheartedly that our elections can be hacked. And by the way, we've been doing everything we can to secure them. And the bad guys got around it this time, but here, we're going to do these other things. Here's what we've done already, and here's what we're now going to do to make sure that particular hack doesn't work in the future. Okay, well, the public kind of can accept that. That's like a responsible way to talk about risk, right? What doesn't work, in my estimation, is to say, everything's fine. Our machines are air-gapped. Our databases are air-gapped. You can't hack this stuff. And then we get hacked. And then what do you say to the public? Oh, well, I don't know. I don't know what you say. We were kidding, which is why I get back to the more Enlightenment way of thinking about things, which I think is kind of the basis for this whole institution, which is, no, look, when we identify problems, we're gonna really look at the problem. We're gonna tell everybody that there's a problem. We're gonna attack it from a bunch of different angles. We're gonna debate the solutions to the problem vigorously in the public. We're gonna bring in the best minds of the world to try and address this problem. And we're not gonna try and obfuscate the fact that we don't have all the answers. And I think, again, as FDR said, look, we're going to try something, and if it doesn't work, we're going to admit it and then try something else until we get it right. Again, the public gets that, and I think they'll give you the benefit of the doubt if you admit that you don't have all the answers, and then something bad happens.
Let's take some questions from our group here. Yeah.
So, it's a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed being election judge this last cycle, and it made me think a lot about how disaggregated the responsibilities for elections are in the states, between the states, the counties, the townships. And I wonder, take on whether that's an asset or liability.
Well, so the thing that's not disaggregated.
The question, if everybody heard it, was about the disaggregated elections. We've got every little town clerk and county clerk running things, which you might think is a big mess. On the other hand, there's some virtues to it as well. Yeah.
Right. So the one thing that's not disaggregated is the vendors who control pretty much all the technology. So there's basically 3 vendors. Between the 3 of them, control about 90 to 95% of all the infrastructure. That includes the machines as well as the software that connects the databases to the clerk's network to the website. So the beginning of where the vote's housed, all the way through the program of the machine to the publishing of the result. And so it's funny, the NSA people I've talked to have said, they're like, yeah, if I was going to try and go rig an election in the US, I wouldn't mess with the election officials at all. To your point, it's too hard. There's too many of them. I would just go hack the vendors. Which makes you wonder if Russia kind of wanted to get caught. Like they didn't need to go. If they really wanted to rig the election for Trump, they could have done it with nobody noticing. The fact that they were so ham-handed about it makes me think that they wanted to get caught, which I think actually goes to this trying to destroy trust in democracy. Like the Russians are in your networks. Anyway.
But it's worth pointing out, I mean, although it is a big mess, it's worth pointing out that hacking the election is a little bit harder given that everything is so spread out and decentralized. Yeah. There are certainly problems with the fact that we have very little like federal central election administration and election regulation, but that's potentially one benefit is it's not easy to just, there's no one computer you have to hack into to change the national vote. Mm-hmm. So.
Hi. Is it on? I don't think it's on.
Anyway, you talked about Congress appropriating hundreds of millions of dollars. What is it actually making it down to election officials, and what are they doing with it?
No. 5% of it's been spent.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's like an order of magnitude less than what we need. We probably need about $3 billion to really get at the problem. Part of this is just procurement cycles and things like that. That like they potentially you could get through it all before 2020. Get through the 383 million. Part of it was, especially at the beginning, there was just a lack of sense of urgency. I mean, as you can imagine, there's a lot of politics wrapped in this. A lot of more conservative election officials felt like this was all about attacking Trump and delegitimizing his presidency. So they were reticent to get involved. A lot of people worried about federal overreach and so on and so forth. So it's possible they could spend it all before 2020, but unlikely.
We've done some survey work here at the Harris School with AP and NRC just on voters' beliefs about election security and what should we do. And almost universally, American voters think we should spend more money on it. It's a big problem. The president and Congress and Homeland Security and all of these federal organizations should take some responsibility for it. And for the most part, the federal government is not doing very much. And I think the public realizes this is a problem.
And I think one of the most important things that the federal government needs to do, and one of our colleagues, Ethan De Mesquita, he put out a paper on cyber deterrence, which is kind of a new topic, topic. It's basically taking the idea of deterrence that started during the Cold War with nuclear weapons and modernizing it for cybersecurity, because the whole reason why the paper ballots and the audits are important is because the infrastructure is kind of unsecurable. So the paper ballots and the audits are kind of a stopgap for if everything's hacked, we can still go in and check and make sure it was right. If you want to stop the bad guys from hacking to begin with, which I would argue is better than just having the backstop of the paper ballots and the audits, having a real robust deterrence policy in place where the president stands up and says very clearly, anybody who does this is going to have serious repercussions coming at them, and we're not going to, we're not going to limit ourselves in what our response could be to that, and something far more eloquent than I could come up with. And that hasn't happened either. And next to the paper ballots and audits in every state and every county, a very robust cyber deterrence message from the White House to the Russians and anybody else is probably the second best thing that we could have, and we don't have that either.
No. Yeah, I think if Ethan were here, he would probably say that this is a key issue that we should be working on that people have not thought very seriously about. Classical deterrence. There's a lot of theories about classical deterrence, like nuclear wars and so forth. There's not a lot of theory about cyber deterrence, and one of the key differences is that there's an attribution problem. You often don't know who's attacking you and who's directing it and so forth. And so that theoretically makes this a really interesting and hard problem to solve. But certainly part of the solution has got to be deterrence, because we're never going to be able to prevent attacks entirely. We're going to have to respond through our equilibrium behavior, right? Mm-hmm. Off the equilibrium path, we're gonna respond in a strategic way that's gonna make people not want to hack us. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you kicked off by talking about some of the operational challenges, with
question was about lines at polls and in what places do people have really good practices in place, and how can we replicate those practices in other places so that people aren't waiting for many hours to vote?
I'm glad you asked, because I feel like I've been totally dumping on all the election officials in the country, and actually there's a lot of very good ones who do great things. And many of them work here in Chicago and in Cook County. In fact, when we were building our model in 2008, and when I was trying to figure out what I could legitimately hold election officials accountable for in battleground states, I was talking to the election officials here in Chicago about it, because they are really good. So what you've seen many places do is they extend their early vote hours and absentee capability, because that gets people out of line to begin with, right? They're not voting on election day. Secondly, they have people vote on paper ballots. At the same time, because you obviously want to accommodate for the disabled, there's touchscreen voting machines that have audio and so on, so that the disabled can vote wherever they happen to live. So you can have one per precinct. It's not cost prohibitive to do that. A bunch of privacy booths so that you don't have the long lines and so on. What DHS has been funding, that they've only done at the state level in a few counties, but hopefully the rest of the country would have it, is there's these sensors you can put on your network that the federal government will pay for, as long as the sensor feeds back to a watch facility to tell you if there's bad guys on your network. It can't see votes, it just can see what the data traffic is on your network. And then having your voter registration databases secured by people who understand how to do that. In most cases, that is probably moving your voter registration database to a cloud where people who can spend lots and lots of money on very good cybersecurity people like Amazon and Google can secure the database for you. This internal workforce issue of finding people who can do cybersecurity is kind of an unsolvable problem for most of these counties for the next couple of decades. If you're in Cook County, you can probably find some guy or gal who cares about their country and wants to take a pay cut to go do real security on their networks. If you're in Alameda County, Iowa, like there just isn't a person to hire, right? Well, we're going to be doing some work on that in DEFCON this year, where we think that what you might be able to do, though, is find somebody from Alameda County, Iowa, who now lives in Silicon Valley, who would happily volunteer their time to help you secure your network when they come home for the holidays and maybe on conference calls a few days a week. So we're going to, this year, try and set up like a speed dating arranged marriage thing where election officials can get cybersecurity professionals to kind of offer to volunteer their time for them. So I'm hoping that will be a best practice in the future that we're trying to facilitate.
Another thing they can do, and they're increasingly doing more of this, which is good, is just trying to do a little bit more work before the election to predict how bad the lines are going to be. There is currently an online tool that MIT researchers have developed where you can just go online and punch in the details of your election, and they'll help you predict how long the line's going to be, and you can play around with it and figure out, okay, how many check-in stations do I need? How many voting stations do I need? How many volunteers do I need? And it is a little bit of a tricky problem in the sense that there are lots of nonlinearities. It's a hard kind of operations research problem, and it could be the case that your current setup has 2-hour waits, but if you just add in one more check-in station, the longest wait's going to be 20 minutes. So there are lots of places where you can figure out, just with a little bit of extra thought, where can we improve? So we're hoping for more of that in the future, but yeah.
Have all these cybersecurity issues basically killed the notion of online voting? Because at one point that was said, this is going to be the way to the future, and you do everything else online, and access issues and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Is there any possibility of that ever happening in the foreseeable future?
It's like we planted this question here. This is something that the Cyber Policy Initiative is working on right now. And we have a grant to work on it, and we've been collecting data. There is online voting in several places. Estonia has online voting. Canada has online voting in some cases. And West Virginia just experimented with online voting in 2018. And so I am currently analyzing a bunch of data from West Virginia to figure out One, what were the participatory effects of that? Does this really induce people to vote who otherwise wouldn't have voted? Which it seems like it does. It seems like having online voting available to you as an option increases turnout by 3 to 5 percentage points. So there is, in fact, a positive effect, as you would hope. And maybe that's a good thing for increasing the representativeness of the voting population. But on the other hand, online voting or mobile voting raises all kinds of serious security concerns that are pretty hard to solve.
Yeah.
And I think I would be very worried about nationwide mobile voting in the United States because of those concerns. And I think obviously people are working hard on that. Maybe there will be technological solutions, but I'm not holding my breath yet.
Yeah, the cryptographer guys that we work with at DEFCON, they think that it's probably about a decade off that the cryptology and so on would be such that they would be comfortable saying, okay, yeah, you could do this in a secure way. But that's also, they're not saying never. They're just saying we're not there now. And so I think that's why a lot of the research Anthony's doing is so important, so that we when the technology's ready, we actually kind of know how to do this and so on.
And you do find that the public is not there either. I mean, even though there is this positive effect that there are some people willing to do it, a lot of people in the public are saying this is a nightmare and I wouldn't even vote if there was online voting. And so I think there are lots of things to be worried about with online voting. We are out of time, but it was great talking to you, Jake.
Yes,
Thank
you
you all
too.
for
Thanks for coming.
joining us.